Just a warning, this is going to be a comprehensive episode. It's going to cover nearly all my thoughts on the red pill that I've accumulated over the years, and I have a lot of thoughts. If you're not ready for a deep dive into the subject of the red pill, I suggest listening to this episode in parts. So first off, what is the red pill? Different people will give you different definitions, and of course many people now will use the term red-pilled to refer to any phenomenon where a person realizes an uncomfortable or contrarian truth about something. But when I use the term red pill in this episode, I'm specifically talking about human sexuality and the online discussion of it. And unlike most chronically online partisans will tell you, what the red pill is really about, what it's always been about, is nature versus nurture. I understand that people have very polarized views on the red pill. Some will tell you that it's about men being radicalized by bigots and misogynists. Some will tell you that it's about society being structured to support gynocentric ideologies. Some will try to paint the red pill as a political phenomenon. While each of these things can be connected to the red pill discussion, at the heart of it, these things are not what the red pill is really about. At the root of it all, the red pill is about nature versus nurture. And in this episode, I will make the case for why that is. My name is Sebastian Rey. This is The List Podcast, Episode 4. You can sub to this podcast on YouTube and Spotify, and if you want to know who I am and what The List is, listen to Episode 0 of this podcast. Links in description. So why do I say that the red pill has to do with nature versus nurture? To answer this, we need to know a little bit about biology. All things in the universe can be classified as either living or non-living. Generally, living things are able to grow, metabolize, respond to external stimuli, and adapt. Non-living things generally cannot grow, lack metabolism, are not capable of responding to stimuli, and cannot adapt. However, living things also generally die. Because of this, there are two goals most living things have to complete for their species to continue inhabiting the planet. Those being the goals of survival and reproduction. Sure, one can argue that certain organisms like viruses don't actually have to survive in the traditional sense of the word, because they don't really consume energy. But even then, viruses still must reproduce. If they didn't do that, viruses wouldn't exist. All living things, including humans, must either reproduce or survive and reproduce to persist at all. There's simply no other way. Accomplishing these goals is necessary to our very existence. So where do nature and nurture fit into all of this? Well, generally, for an organism to survive or reproduce, there are only two basic systems it can use to do that. Either it can use some currently existing structure which is built on or in its body, or it can adapt itself to the environment in some manner. Broadly speaking, nature has to do with the currently existing structures of an organism and how those structures influence behavior, and broadly speaking, nurture is anything that influences an organism from the outside. Nature and nurture are both necessary to life. All living creatures exist in an environment of some kind, which means to survive or reproduce in that environment, the organism must, by necessity, adapt or adjust its behavior according to how that environment is structured. If it doesn't do this, that creature and its species will die off. So when an organism or process is influenced by its environment, we could classify that as a nurture-type influence. However, it is not possible for nurture to affect something unless there's a something which exists in the first place. The environment can't influence a process unless there is a process already there which existed before the influence. When an organism behaves according to how it's built or structured to behave, we could classify that as a nature-type influence. There are, of course, people who will argue that nature and nurture are constantly affecting each other, making it impossible to tell what behaviors can really be classified as nature or nurture effects. And this is sort of true. Organisms and their actions must always adapt to environments, yet environments are always influenced by the presence of organisms. By simply existing inside an environment, a living creature affects what that environment is made of. So, since nature and nurture affect each other, it can sometimes be hard to tell which parts of biological life stem from nature and which stem from nurture. The thing is, when you scale up past the cellular level to the level of mammals and larger creatures, many behavioral tendencies do seem to be mainly nature-driven or mainly nurture-driven. For example, if a child watches videos of kids dancing every time they're mad, and one day the child starts to dance when angry, we can presume that the child learned to do this. In other words, the child adapted its behavior to fit the environment. As a result, we could say that this is mainly a nurture-driven behavior. Or we can take something as simple as breathing. Breathing is something most of us are able to do the moment we leave the womb. And even as adults, breathing is not something we consciously think about most of the time. Even though it can be controlled, breathing is something you usually do automatically. As a result, we can assume that the act of breathing is mainly a nature-driven process. Now, of course, there are many cases where it's not entirely clear whether nature or nurture is the main culprit behind an action. But the fact that there are behaviors which are mainly adaptive or mainly innate should tell us that nature and nurture do have clear and distinct influences on human behavior. So now the big question we're all here for. What does all this have to do with the red pill? Well, for a long time, psychologists have studied human behavior, including human sexuality, through the lens of nature and nurture. However, in the last 30 to 50 years, it seems psychology, at least in the US, has become somewhat divided and compartmentalized when it comes to nature and nurture. In fact, in the last 50 years, the people who focused on the nurture side of human psychology started to dominate the psychological sciences. It's not like the nature side just disappeared. The people who studied the nature side of psychology were still there, writing books and doing research. But the focus on nurture became so overwhelmingly popular in the world of psychology that many people completely forgot there was a nature group. And alongside all this, another curious thing happened. In the last 30 to 50 years, many of the ideas about psychology made their way into popular culture, at least in the West. And since nurture was the primary focus of psychology at the time, the ideas about psychology which ended up in the culture happened to be ideas which focused on nurture. Now, I can only speak to my own experience here. At the time of this release, I am 33 years old, and where I grew up, I wasn't exposed to much psychology at all, at least not officially. However, the number of times I did hear people talk about it, it was always a nurture explanation that came out. Why is that person acting in such a weird way? Well, they must have been conditioned to behave like that. Why is this person speaking in the ways they are? Well, they must have learned to speak that way from their culture. Why does that guy like the things he likes? Well, he must have been raised to like those things. Their environment must have influenced them. They must have learned this somewhere. If you think about it, these are all nurture explanations for behavior. Learning, conditioning, environmental influence, these are all ideas which stem from the realm of psychology which focuses on how the outside world affects inside processes, aka nurture. But nurture is not the only thing that matters. See, within the last 50 years, just before the internet gained widespread popularity, there was another popular idea that made its way into culture, which is that human sexuality was mainly nurture-driven. Again, I can only speak from my experience, but I can tell you that growing up, I was taught to view sexuality and attraction as this mysterious force that can never be understood. The things people like are just the things they learned to like. There's no predictability to sexual attraction because everyone learns to be attracted to different things. Where I grew up, attraction was more of an abstract idea rather than anything influenced by real-life processes. And for most of my young life, I believed these ideas. But of course, reality can have a way of butting up against even your most strongly held beliefs. As I got older and more interested in human behavior, the more I studied people, the more it seemed to me that there was an undeniable predictability to what people liked and were attracted to. Why is it that people keep telling me attraction is mysterious and unknowable, yet everywhere I look in the world, people consistently like similar patterns of things and make similar patterns of dating choices? There's of course some variability to it, but it seemed to me like what I'd been told was not entirely true. There was something more going on here, some underlying pattern behind these behaviors. So my question became, why? What's the reason for these patterns I'm observing? It can't purely be cultural, because people come from all sorts of backgrounds and cultures, and yet when left to their own devices, people from drastically different cultures will still often engage in eerily similar behavior patterns when it comes to dating and attraction. How could that be? Ultimately, the reason this was all mysterious to me was because I, like many others, was raised in a culture where human psychology and sexuality were viewed through the lens of nurture. In that culture, nurture was the main thing that mattered and was the explanation for nearly everything humans do and every preference humans have. The red pill was a reaction to that culture. In the early to mid 2000s, as the internet became more widespread, a counterculture was brewing beneath the surface. The internet provided us with a form of communication humans had never seen before. People from all over the world, who would never have come into contact otherwise, were talking. And of course, one of the things people inevitably started talking about was dating. And like me, there were many who noticed that when it came to dating, the way people behaved did not necessarily match up with what the dominant culture was promoting. So, these people started trading notes, asking why, coming up with their own hypotheses to try to explain and predict how sexuality worked. This is what the Red Pill initially was, a decentralized online exchange of notes on the topic of human sexuality in an attempt to explain its patterns. Some people wanted to use this information to their own advantage in dating. Some simply wanted a more accurate model of sexuality. In either case, this was the initial intent. But it would not stay this way forever, for the drive to succeed in dating is near universal, and as more people got online, more people started asking the same questions I did, eventually finding their way into the Red Pill. So naturally, over the late 2000s and 2010s, the Red Pill slowly grew in size. But such growth can't come without side effects. It was almost inevitable that, as the Red Pill grew in size, people outside of the discussion started to take notice. And while some simply shrugged the Red Pill off as a bunch of losers, some saw an opportunity. Some wanted to profit off the movement, some wanted to sow disinformation, and some saw an opportunity to turn things political. But eventually, grifters of all kinds would find their way into the Red Pill as well. Initially, one of the most significant things Red Pillers pointed out was that many of the sexual behaviors we can see in humans are suspiciously correlated with evolution, specifically sexual biology. For instance, one of the things we can generally see across cultures is that men tend to be much less picky than women when it comes to who they're willing to sleep with and when. Women tend to be more picky, and this is not just true today, but has also been true throughout recorded history. Interestingly enough, it seems this behavior could be related to our reproductive systems. Men generally produce sperm, women generally have eggs, and sperm are far more plentiful than eggs on average. It makes sense that the organism with more reproductive cells would want sex more often, while the organism with fewer reproductive cells would be pickier about who they sleep with. This is not the only observation Red Pillers made. In fact, there were many human behaviors and traits Red Pillers picked out which could be viewed through the lens of nature. Some of these observations were consistent enough that some Red Pillers began to create full-on models of human sexuality, centering around nature, evolution, and biology. But of course, grifters distorted this whole discussion. As grifters entered the space, what we saw was a shift towards the more extreme aspects of Red Pill discussions and individuals. Rather than substantive arguments being highlighted, what became popular and portrayed as relevant were the most inflammatory remarks and statements, which, to an outsider, made the Red Pill seem insane. Then all grifters had to do was sell their own viewpoints and perspectives as the solution. For instance, instead of attacking the idea of evolution influencing behavior, what grifters would do is make the discussion about how one guy in the Red Pill space said that women are bad at X, Y, and Z. Then the grifter would say something to the effect of, "Normal people would never think women are bad at X, Y, and Z. A normal person would actually believe what I believe. This is why the Red Pill is bad. Buy my course." We can see a similar phenomenon in politics. Rather than attacking the opponent's best position, what political campaigns will often do is take the most extreme-sounding thing the opponent has said, in order to portray themselves and their own party as the more virtuous choice. In the Red Pill, what this resulted in was a lot of people outside the space viewing Red Pillers as extremists, not actually understanding what the Red Pill was initially about. But it didn't stop there, because eventually this grifting would have unintended effects on the Red Pill itself. The thing is, the internet doesn't stop. Even after grifters entered the space and distorted the discussion, the Red Pill, or at least Red Pill conversations, continued to grow, and this created a problem. As new people entered the space, what they inevitably saw was not the Red Pill's initial purpose, but grifters' new packaging of the Red Pill. Some original content and content creators were still on the scene, but even people who were well-intentioned were shuttled over to the most extreme content regarding the Red Pill. And the views they developed as a result of this ended up being reactions to those extremes and misrepresentations. Over time, this changed the Red Pill landscape. Rather than having intellectual discourse about how to best interpret human behavior, people entering the Red Pill community were only discussing things peripherally or menially related to the Red Pill. And the new red pill that came out of this was a husk of its former self, a bastardization of what was once a legitimate point of contention. Within a couple decades, the red pill went from being a discussion about evolution and its effects on sexuality to petty commentaries about Lamborghini's misogyny and looks-maxing. At this point in time, many who cover red pill topics do not understand nor have ever thought about the distinction between nature and nurture and how it relates to sexuality. Many of the views people have, both inside and outside the red pill, are reactions to some element of the culture which is perceived to be extreme or unfair. And even people who have thought about nature and nurture will often find themselves getting sidetracked and led down reactivistic rabbit holes until their views are shaped by extremes as well. Of course, at the bottom of it all, I believe the red pill is still about nature versus nurture. It always has been. But the more complex and interesting ideas inevitably get buried beneath gigantic piles of shit-slinging and virtue signaling. However, if you were to take your time and examine as many views about the red pill as possible, if you were to take a good faith look both for and against the red pill, going as far back as the early 2000s, what you'd ultimately see is that red pillers almost always viewed human sexuality through the lens of nature, and those who oppose the red pill almost always view sexuality through the lens of nurture. Many people will never see this because they're not willing to do all that work. But at the very root of things, the red pill discussion has always essentially been an argument between nature-focused people and nurture-focused people. So where do I fall on this spectrum? Am I a red pillar? A blue pillar? Neither? Well, it's complicated. Over the years, I've spent a disproportionate amount of time pondering the red pill and this nature versus nurture problem, and I have my own thoughts on it. First off, like I explained at the beginning of the episode, I believe that nature and nurture affect all biological systems, and I also believe that human beings, although we may sometimes deny it, are biological creatures. We are, essentially, animals. How do you prove that humans are animals? Well, it's pretty simple. Do you have to eat things and drink water to stay alive? Then you're probably an animal. All animals use energy, and in order to replace that energy, most animals have to eat. Most organisms have a strange relationship with water as well, in that most organisms either need it to stay alive or use it as a growth multiplier. Human bodies are no exception. Also, can your body heal itself? Then you're probably an animal. Your body is made up of many small organisms, and when you get sick or injured, these organisms will mobilize to fight off infection and heal whatever is wounded. This type of healing would not be possible if your body wasn't a biological system. Another question, do you have a reproductive system? Were you born with a penis or a vagina or some variation of these things? Then you're probably an animal. No creature lives forever. All animal bodies eventually die, either from age or physical damage, which means that all animals must reproduce for the species to continue on. If you were born with reproductive organs and a reproductive system, then you're probably an animal. And as animals, I believe that nature must influence human behavior, including sexual behavior and sexual attraction. Why does nature have to influence sexuality? Because sex is how humans reproduce. The thing is, in order for us to reproduce, we don't have to want babies, we just have to want sex. And sexual attraction is the main thing which drives us to have sex. Which means that sexual attraction plays a gigantic role in whether or not our species continues on. It makes sense, therefore, that nature would have some influence on sexual attraction, as well as more general sexual behaviors. Because if not, people wouldn't have enough kids, and humans would die off. Now yes, it's possible at the moment to use in vitro fertilization to have babies, but in vitro fertilization is not affordable or available to most people, which means most of us have to make babies the old-fashioned way for the species to keep going. Also, just because we have some new technological innovation does not necessarily get rid of thousands of years of evolved traits and tendencies. Like Dr. Alan Grant famously said in Jurassic Park,
T-Rex doesn't want to be fat, he wants to hunt. Just suppress 65 million years of gut instinct.
But although I believe nature influences sexual attraction, I don't think that's the whole story. Like I said at the start, all living creatures are affected by both nature and nurture. Red pillars are very good at discussing the nature side of sexuality, but one thing red pillars almost never talk about is how nurture also influences sexual attraction and behavior. Nurture has to play a role because no nature-driven process can exist for a long time without being influenced by its environment. Nurture is what determines how nature is able to express itself, which means that nurture must play some role in sexuality. So in order to have a more complete picture of human sexuality, we have to look at both the nature side of things and the nurture side of things. Well, in the next part of this episode, that's what I'm going to attempt to discuss. And trust me, there's a lot to talk about. However, I believe if we're going to discuss these two influences, we must always start with the nature side of things. For it is not possible to understand how nurture influences a process without first understanding the process. So how does nature influence sexuality? This is a huge subject of debate even within the nature-focused community. But I think there are some basic conclusions we can draw if we simply start from first principles. Now I'm about to outline some ideas here that may be controversial, and ultimately my beliefs could change in the future. But I told you I was going to give you nearly all my thoughts on the red pill, so that's what I'm going to do. First off, what does nature really mean? At the beginning of this episode, I said that nature is basically when pre-existing structures influence organism behavior. But there's a lot more to that discussion. See, a lot of people, especially people who've been raised in Western culture, have misconceptions about how nature works. A lot of people think that nature causes every individual within a group to have the exact same characteristics. This is not how nature works. Nature doesn't mean every individual will have the exact same traits and behaviors. In fact, nature always creates variances and mutations, even when the environment stays the same. But nature does result in commonalities, trends, and tendencies in the behavior and traits of a species. Sometimes those trends can be stronger, sometimes they can be weaker, but those trends always exist, because if they didn't exist, there would be no such thing as a species at all. Think about it. If there were no tendencies or commonalities in human beings, every person would be born with a completely random set of characteristics. There would be people born with green skin and scales, people born with tentacles instead of limbs, people born as just a ball of flesh, and that would be normal. The reason why humans aren't that random is because of nature. It's because there are trends and commonalities in the genetic coding of humans. Those trends are not perfect. Again, nature always creates variation even in a constant environment. But nature does result in very common characteristics. So what does this have to do with sexuality? Well, if nature can affect your physical characteristics, why can't nature also influence your psychology and behavior as well? We know that survival instincts exist. For example, almost all humans are able to experience pain, and pain could be classified as a survival instinct. It's a psychological mechanism which makes you aware of injuries and illnesses so you can address them. Did you have to learn to feel the various feelings of pain? When you were a kid, did you have to learn to make your knee feel hurt when you fell off your bike? No. The capacity to experience pain is something most of us are born with. Pain, hunger, thirst, the fear response, these can all be classified as survival instincts. Environmental conditions might influence when you feel these things, but the feelings themselves were not something you had to learn. Now, if we know that survival instincts exist, and if humans must survive and reproduce for the species to continue, then maybe there is another category of instincts humans are often born with, called reproduction instincts. Environmental conditions might influence when and how reproduction instincts take shape, and not every person may feel these instincts or respond to them in the same way. But it's possible that many of our sexual behaviors and attraction mechanisms are, in fact, instinctual, especially since we need reproduction for the species to survive. So if nature affects sexuality, then that's likely how it would happen, by creating commonalities in what people are attracted to and how people behave sexually, and by creating reproduction instincts that people are often born with. So what are some of those commonalities and instincts? Well, when it comes to the nature side of things, I think a very large percent of human sexual behaviors are in fact connected to gamete function. What are gametes? They are the basic reproductive cells of humans, eggs and sperm. Generally speaking, men produce sperm, and generally speaking, women have eggs. Now, the average man will produce around 500 billion sperm cells throughout his life, and the average woman is born with around 300,000 eggs. And that's it. Those are all the eggs she gets. And as women age, those eggs slowly die off. This generally leads to a window of time where women are the most fertile, or capable of giving birth. These extremely basic facts, I believe, have a large impact on human sexual behaviors and interests. As I stated before, women across the world and throughout history tend to be more picky than men about who they'll sleep with and when. Well, this behavior may be linked to the fact that women have eggs. In comparison to sperm, eggs are extremely small in number. Mathematically speaking, it is not possible for a woman to give her eggs away to every guy. So on a biological level, women have to be picky about who they give their eggs to. But I think the differences go much further. For example, women will sometimes complain that men are often attracted to younger women in their late teens and early 20s. Well, I think the reason for this is because, on average, men may unconsciously prefer fertility when selecting partners. It's the first thing that men will often look at least. This doesn't mean it's okay to mess with children. I do not promote or condone that. I'm strictly talking about being attracted to adults. And yes, I'm aware that different countries and regions define adulthood differently, but that's a separate discussion. Of course, red pill commentators have talked about men being attracted based on fertility before, but I think what's more important is why men tend to look for fertility. Think about it this way. If your goal, as an organism, is to reproduce, wouldn't it be logical to look for partners who are the most capable of reproducing? Well, due to the way eggs work, not all women are equally capable of reproducing. There's generally an age range where women are the most fertile. So if you're a man and you want the best chance at having kids, from a biological perspective, wouldn't it make sense to pick women in that age range? Because if you don't, you're less likely to have kids. And when people have fewer kids, the species is more likely to die off. Thus, the unconscious preference for fertility may drive a lot of men's initial attraction towards women, at least in many cases. This doesn't mean that men have to care about fertility, or must care only about fertility. It's just one of the things men may unconsciously select for. A reproduction instinct, if you will. Of course, many men don't have the option of getting with a woman they prefer, and in the absence of choices, many men will just settle for a woman, or at least the nearest sexual option. But this tells us that it is possible for men's sexual behaviors to be shaped by what's available or what we think is available, and this demonstrates that nurture is playing some role in male sexuality. In any case, if men unconsciously prefer fertility, what do women generally unconsciously prefer? Well, some people aren't going to like this, but I think it's observably true. I think women tend to unconsciously prefer dominance when selecting partners, or at least dominance is the first thing straight women will often look at. Now, I will say this, I don't think all women are attracted to the same kinds of dominance. I think different women perceive dominance differently depending on the situation and depending on their own individual idea of dominance. However, there are definitely commonalities in what women perceive as dominant. Basically, I split it into two categories, social dominance and physical dominance. Social dominance is what it sounds like, factors and traits which make someone more dominant or perceived as more dominant within a social group. Being strong-willed, having a commanding or unwavering disposition, being highly skilled at something, being well-liked, having lots of money or resources, having lots of attention, or being at the center of attention in a given environment. These are all common traits women might look at when evaluating social dominance. Even small things like the shakiness of your voice and even the kinds of language you use can play into your perceived social dominance. For example, someone who's constantly qualifying their statements or who's very soft-spoken might be viewed as less socially dominant. In general, traits which are more dominance-oriented tend to be viewed as more masculine. There are also physical dominance indicators, things like being tall, being physically strong or imposing, having muscularity and low body fat, having good genetic traits like facial symmetry. These can all play into your perceived physical dominance. Dominance is not the only thing women will look at when selecting a partner, but it is often the first thing. Also, since no guy can be dominant in every situation and in every area, women will generally single out certain traits when evaluating dominance. For example, some women only want tall, good-looking guys, but other women might respond more to charisma. Both of these things are related to dominance, but they're not the same kinds of dominance. As a side note, this is why I don't like the alpha male discussion. Many people seem to think that the term alpha male refers to someone who's dominant in all situations at all times, but this is obviously not possible. People will practice their whole lives to be good at one thing, but it's really not possible for someone to be dominant at everything all the time. No one can be the best physicist and the best football player, and the strongest man, and the funniest comedian, and the best fighter pilot, and the president. If you're defining an alpha male as someone who is the best at everything all the time, then no, alpha males don't exist. However, it does appear to be the case that women prefer guys who are dominant in some kind of way, generally speaking. And the more areas in which a guy is dominant, the more likely women will perceive him as attractive. Of course, women being attracted to dominance is also something red pillers have talked about, although some red pillers will drastically oversimplify this process. But the interesting part to me is why women select for dominance. If it's true that women only have a small number of eggs to give away, then from an evolutionary perspective, who would it make the most sense to give those eggs away to? Remember, women cannot mathematically give their eggs to every guy. So who would it be the most logical to save those eggs for? Most likely, you'd want to save those eggs for a person who has some kind of above average traits or resources. In other words, guys who are dominant in some area. Ideally, you'd want the guy to be the most dominant in the most number of areas, but that's not always possible. Also, some women might get with a guy hoping he becomes dominant in the future. Some women will get with a guy thinking he's dominant and then find out later he's not, but the initial attraction was driven by her perception of dominance. Here's another thing that people don't discuss much. If it's true that women generally select for dominance, then incels will always exist, because dominance is inherently exclusionary. Think about it like this. If every person in the world had exactly $1 million, no one would be rich, because everyone has the same amount of money. For you to be rich, you'd have to have more money than everybody else. Well, in the same way, for someone to be dominant, there must be people who are less dominant. That's what dominance is, being above others in some area. You can't have rich without poor, and you can't have dominant people without less dominant people. Because of this, it's likely there will always be some percent of guys who aren't able to attract women. They don't even necessarily have to be bad people, although that's a popular stereotype of incels. Also, because not every guy can be dominant, and because not all women can get with the dominant man, it means people will always need to compete with one another to attract mates, making humans a competition species. And if we look out at human society, we can see evidence of humans being geared towards competition. Everyday hobbies, businesses, politics, entire economies, and even whole nations are often driven in large part by competition. Of course, not all of this competition necessarily has to do with sexual attraction per se, but it might be the case that sexual attraction is a contributor, possibly even a catalyst, for much of our instinct to compete. Of course, women's attraction can also be shaped by what's available or what women think is available. If a woman doesn't believe she can get with or retain an ideal guy, she might settle for someone with fewer preferred traits. And again, this demonstrates that nurture is playing some role in sexuality. Here's another trait that I think is nature-driven. In general, I think women are very hesitant to reveal their own sexual preferences to men, their real sexual preferences. And I think the reason for this hesitation may actually be evolutionary. Imagine this, if women were completely open, even explicit, about what they're attracted to, what would men do? A lot of men would try to use this information to get laid. That doesn't sound too bad, right? But here's the thing, if it's true that women are selecting for dominance, what women don't want is a guy who's faking it. They want guys who are actually dominant, not fake dominant. So how do you tell the difference? Well, obviously some things can't be faked. You can't fake having good genetics, really. But there are certain things guys can fake, like a confident personality, or popularity, or sometimes wealth. Today it seems like you can even fake being tall with certain kinds of surgery. When guys know exactly what women want in explicit detail, it becomes easier for guys to fake the traits women are looking for. And if you're a woman with only a small number of eggs to give out, you definitely don't want to give your eggs to someone who's faking those traits. Because of this, I think many women have evolved a knee-jerk reflex of sorts. This reflex, I think, creates a literal feeling of discomfort at the idea of men knowing, or thinking they know, women's real preferences. Different women respond to this reflex differently. Some women will simply become more silent. Some women will try to change the subject. Some will throw out flares or misinform. Some women will tell the truth but only partial truths. Some women will just flat out bold-faced lie, and might even bring other women in on the lie in order to paint a certain narrative. And in some cases, these narratives can even spread into the broader culture. The problem is, when misinformation spreads into the culture, it can have the unintended effect of creating movements like the red pill, that are reactions, some might say overreactions, to that misinformation. Ultimately, when you have men constantly trying to figure out women's sexuality, and women constantly trying to throw men off the trail, it can lead to an arms race of information, where different parties are continually fighting for control over the narrative. A neutral viewer who just wants the truth can have a hard time figuring out what's really going on. Of course, women deserve to have a say when it comes to their own preferences, which is what makes this subject complicated. I don't think you should necessarily disbelieve women when discussing sexuality, because there are women out there who will tell the truth. But if women's actions are consistently straying from their words, it will inevitably force men to develop their own concepts and models about women's sexuality. This is why we need a more methodological approach to this subject. If everyone's got a different narrative they're pushing, there are really only a couple ways you can actually figure out what's true. You can either take the research route, which many people do. The problem is that personal biases can sometimes make their way even into scientific research. The other way is to start with first principles. Start with what you know must be true, and work from there. Build a model of behavior that functions prior to scientific evidence. This is what's called a priori reasoning. If you haven't guessed, that's ultimately what I've been trying to do with all this, if only to satisfy my own curiosity. Anyway, these are just some examples of how nature might influence sexuality and people's behavior surrounding sexuality. So now that we have a brief framework for how nature might influence sexuality, what about nurture? First off, what does nurture really mean? At the beginning of this episode, I said that nurture is basically when an organism adjusts or adapts itself to the external environment in some way. But there's much more to that discussion. Just like with the nature side of things, I think a lot of people have misconceptions about how nurture works. A lot of people seem to think that nurture can completely negate or overwrite the effects of nature. That's not really how it works. Nurture can only affect you insofar as nature allows. I'll explain. If you think about it, when organisms adjust their behavior to adapt to their environment, organisms can only adjust their behavior using the pre-existing structures they have available. For example, I can learn a new language, but if I have no vocal cords, I'll never be able to speak that language, which means my ability to use what I learn is going to be extremely dependent on the pre-existing structures of my body. I can't just grow new vocal cords because human bodies don't let us do that. I can have kids who have vocal cords, and they might be able to speak the language. Also, technological advancements or surgery might give me some kind of vocal ability, but no amount of learning or experience by itself will cause me to grow vocal cords. This is because nurture can't actually change my physical body to a very high degree. It can change what I do with my body, but my body and what it's made of will always be a limiting factor in what I can do, and the ways in which I can adapt. As for the brain, well, that's a different conversation. Part of the reason why we have brains in the first place might have been to make it easier for us to adapt to environments. In fact, I wrote a whole book on it called Value Assignment: The Primary Function of the Brain. The point is, nurture will always be limited by nature, and nature will always be limited by nurture as well. These are inescapable facts. Even if what I argued in my book is correct, nurture can still only influence you insofar as your brain allows. For example, if it's true that many women have the predisposition of being attracted to dominance, then nurture is really only going to change what women view as dominance. Nurture isn't going to get rid of the predisposition itself. It is possible to make it so that women with this predisposition can't have kids. But even if you did this, you'd kind of be screwing the human race. The entire reason why women have this predisposition is basically to keep the species going. Women select dominant men because those men will give her kids the best chance at survival. Without that process, her kids become more susceptible to disease, to death, and are less likely to reproduce themselves. It's probably the same for most other sexual predispositions and instincts. If you were to somehow wipe out all sexual instincts, you wouldn't necessarily be making things better, because those instincts are probably there for a reason, a very basic survival reason. The good thing is, without some sort of extreme measure, it's pretty hard to get rid of these predispositions, because again, nurture can't overwrite nature. This is probably why reproduction instincts keep showing up, even in cultures which push for equality between men and women. That being said, I think nurture can have a greater effect on sexuality than most red pillars will give it credit for. For example, people's attitudes towards sexuality as well as what sexual practices are common are extremely variable and will change from culture to culture. You might think, well, culture doesn't change nature, but the thing is, if nurture is influencing a specific behavior more than nature is, then nurture is going to be the important process to study. Genetics can make it so that every person is predisposed to liking apples. But if nobody actually eats apples because we're all told they're poisonous, then that nature isn't really going to make a difference, is it? Because the actual behavior is being driven mainly by nurture. It's true that nurture can't get rid of your genetic predispositions, but in this case, nurture is influencing the outcome more than nature is. And at the end of the day, outcomes are what matters. Also, just because people have an instinct does not mean that people have to follow that instinct. In some cases, nature and nurture clash, forcing people to choose which influence to go with. For example, if you've been raised your whole life to believe that violence is wrong, and one day you have a big fight with someone, your evolutionary instincts might tell you to punch that person in the face. But if your morals tell you that's wrong, you're gonna have to pick whether to follow your morals or to follow your instincts. In other words, what you've learned is going up against what you instinctually want to do. Nature is clashing with nurture, and it is possible to choose nurture. Here's another important question. Why is it that people look for traits other than dominance and fertility? Why aren't evolutionary features the only thing people care about? Well, basically, the reason is because context always plays into sexual selection. People can only pick partners based on what's available or what they think is available. On top of that, people learn to value different characteristics, and what people value doesn't always line up with what's evolutionarily optimal. Some people would rather choose partners based on what they value even when they know what's evolutionarily optimal. In other words, the context of people's environments and values are often more important in determining outcomes than nature is by itself. Remember how I said that nurture determines how nature expresses itself? Well, this is what I was talking about. Context is nurture. It's hard to say whether context plays an equal role to genetics, but you can't say that context doesn't play a role at all. Because in order for that to be the case, we would have to not have values and not live in environments. Also, not everyone has certain reproduction instincts I discussed in the last section. For example, some people simply don't feel sexual jealousy. Also, no matter where you look throughout history, in every culture, gay people have existed. Some of them might have hidden it, but the fact that homosexuality exists in every culture should tell us that not everyone has the same reproduction instincts. But aside from homosexuality, we can see other sexual practices, variations, abnormalities, and eccentricities that stray from the norm in each culture. Some of these might be nature-driven, but some of them might be nurture-driven as well. There's at least some research showing that childhood experiences can have an impact on sexuality. One study showed that, compared to the general population, sex offenders were more likely to have undergone adverse childhood experiences. I'll link the study in the description. In any case, whether they're a nature phenomenon or a nurture phenomenon, it's likely that certain reproduction instincts are variable in how they play out, and in some cases are simply absent from people's brains altogether. Now I know what people are going to ask. What about relationships? Just because certain traits might be evolutionarily optimal doesn't mean those traits are good for long-term relationships. And yes, that's true. But one thing people have to understand is, the concept of a relationship is a relatively recent thing in human history. It's true that humans have been somewhat monogamous throughout all known history, but the concept of a relationship as a thing to engage in, or an ideal to reach toward, is a more or less recent invention, evolutionarily speaking. In other words, relationships are a cultural phenomenon. I'm not saying we shouldn't pursue long-term monogamy. Research has shown over and over that children raised in two-parent homes are statistically better off in a wide range of life outcomes. But it does mean if we're going to pursue long-term relationships, we need to understand where they come from, how nature and nurture play into them, and why relationships fail. Now, in my mind, relationships are their own topic, separate from the main point of this episode, but I'll briefly go over some thoughts I have regarding relationships. First off, there's a whole bunch of reasons why people will tell you that their relationships failed, but in my estimation, there are really only 4 core reasons: cultural norms, infidelity, deception, and abuse. Oftentimes, it's a combination of these things that can cause a relationship to fail, but let's go over each one. We all know what infidelity is, so I probably don't need to explain that. Deception is a pretty clear term as well, but when I say deception, I'm not just talking about verbally lying to someone. Deception can come in various forms. If I present myself as having a certain personality or looking a certain way at the beginning, and then over time I slowly reveal that I'm actually someone different, that would count as deception. I may not have lied to you with words, but I deceived you as to the kind of person I am. Abuse is another one that can come in many forms, with varying degrees of severity. Sometimes abuse means literal crimes being committed, but not always. The reason why abusive relationships fail should be pretty obvious, because even if the abuse is only minor, those minor abuses can add up over time and create resentment, tension, and strain. If there's no other reason to stay together, these relationships are likely to dissipate. But in my opinion, the most interesting reason for relationship failure is cultural norms. Cultural norms are a very common reason why relationships fall apart, but I believe most of the time people don't realize that cultural norms are largely to blame. For example, many people will say that their relationship failed because we just fell out of love. Believe it or not, this has to do with cultural norms. In liberal cultures, the main reason people get together and stay together is based on love and emotion. Happiness is basically the first priority of the relationship. Are you happy with the person you're with? If not, then you should probably break up. This is how people in liberal cultures tend to approach relationships. But in conservative cultures, things are completely different. In conservative cultures, people do not stay in relationships based on love and emotion. In fact, the main reason people stay together in conservative cultures is because people consider it their responsibility to stay with their partner, regardless of happiness. The reason for this may be because these cultures recognize that kids are generally better off with two consistent parents, and communities are generally stronger when men and women are consistently together. But that responsibility can come at the cost of optimum happiness. Also, in conservative cultures, there's more likely to be peer pressure coming from outside the relationship for you to stay in the relationship. Now, I'm not here to tell you whether the liberal approach or the conservative approach is better, although I have my own opinions. But I am pointing out that there is a distinct difference in how people treat relationships in liberal versus conservative cultures. And that difference is often a big contributing factor in relationship longevity and dissipation. Think about it. If all the relationships in your society are based on love and happiness, then it brings up a problem, which is that the emotions of love and happiness are always temporary. This is because brains are not capable of maintaining any emotion for extremely long periods. Even people who experience psychological conditions like depression will have bouts of time where that depression is muted. So if the relationships in your society are based on emotions, then those relationships will almost always be more temporary. Even if you're happy most of the time, the fact that there are dull periods in your relationship will inevitably cause many people to doubt and question their relationship, leading to more relationship failures in your society as a whole. And in general, this is what we see. In liberal cultures, there are lower marriage rates, higher divorce rates, and because relationships fail more often, people tend to have more sexual relationships. And because of this, you have more single-parent homes as well as more revolving door homes, where one parent is regularly getting with new partners. You might say, well, conservatives in the US have low marriage rates and high divorce rates too. And yes, that's true. But this is because American conservatives are, in fact, liberal, at least sexually speaking. They might call themselves conservative, but American culture as a whole has been increasingly liberal since the 60s. And one of the ways you can tell this is by looking at how people tend to approach relationships. If the main thing that keeps relationships together is emotion rather than a sense of responsibility, this should tell you that it is, in fact, a sexually liberal society you're looking at. For the most part, conservatives in the US today approach relationships in a liberal manner, which is probably why you see high divorce rates, low marriage rates, and transient relationships among modern conservatives. All of these are, of course, generalizations. When you're talking about something as complex as human society, there will always be caveats, exceptions, and variants. And of course, liberalism versus conservatism is not the only way that culture can affect relationship length, but it is one big way that I've observed. In any case, if culture can have that much of an impact on sexual relationships, it should tell us that nurture is playing a big role in the process of reproduction. It's just not the same role as nature. The last thing I want to bring up on the topic of nature and nurture is the 4 laws of behavioral genetics. What the heck are the 4 laws of behavioral genetics, one might ask? They are quote-unquote laws or rules which are derived directly from research on behavior genetics. What is behavior genetics? It's a field of research which studies the relationship between genes and psychological traits. Basically, in the year 2000, a guy named Turkheimer proposed 3 laws which he observed were always true of human behavior. Law 1. All psychological traits are partially heritable. Law 2. The effect of being raised in the same family is smaller than the effect of genes. Law 3. Many of the differences between people's psychological traits can't be attributed to either genes or family environment. In 2015, a 4th law was proposed, which states that most complex psychological traits are not shaped by one gene, but by many genes of small effect. From now on, I'll call these laws the FLB, and I'll link sources in the description. Now, the people who believe in the FLB claim that they've solved the nature versus nurture debate, and claim that nature is more impactful than nurture when it comes to predicting human behavior. I have a couple things to say about this. First off, the research that goes into the FLB is not something I'm disputing. Many years of research went into this, with a wide range of controlled variables and what seems to be quality data. What I have a problem with is how nature and nurture are defined by the researchers and by the people who believe in the FLB. See, I think these people define nature and nurture way too narrowly. I think their definitions are so narrow that they don't actually encapsulate the full effects of nature and nurture. In other words, their definitions don't tell the whole tale. So how do these guys define nature and nurture? Basically, they defined nature as genes, and they defined nurture as family environment. In my mind, that is not what nature is or what nurture is. In my opinion, nature and nurture are a little bit broader than that. For example, many organisms don't have actual families in the same way that humans do. Many organisms do not grow up in a family setting or a family environment. Does that mean that nurture is completely absent from these organisms' evolution? No, probably not. Environments always affect organisms and their evolution. When environments influence organisms to behave or change in some way, you can't exactly call that a nature effect. That falls much more under the category of nurture. But if you're defining nurture as just the family environment, I think you're painting an inaccurate picture of what nurture is. The thing is, behavior geneticists know that non-family environments can and do influence human behavior. They just don't call it nurture. And in fact, the 3rd law admits this. The 3rd law of behavior genetics says that many of the differences between people's psychological traits can't be attributed to either genes or the family environment. So what can these differences be attributed to? Well, if you read more about the 3rd law, you'd realize that these differences are just coming from environmental influence outside the family. That sounds a lot like nurture to me. Influence coming from the outside world in some way, aka your environment, is what nurture is, in my estimation. Secondly, if you define nature as just genetics, although it does make research easier, it doesn't necessarily paint the most accurate picture of what nature is. For example, there are organisms on the planet that don't actually have DNA. Many viruses use something called RNA as their method of replication. There are also creatures called prions that have neither DNA nor RNA, but instead replicate via folding proteins. So if prions and some viruses don't have DNA, does nature not apply to them? In my estimation, nature is a broader thing. Nature has to do with any structural influence on organism action. Anytime a creature behaves according to how it's built or structured to behave, I would call that a nature-type influence. It's not just about DNA. And by the way, even if all creatures had DNA, I still don't think nature is just DNA. I look at it like this. Nature isn't just the building blocks, it's also the things they build. It's not just the bricks, it's also the house. In the nature section, we talked about men and women having predispositions towards certain behaviors and sexual interests. But what is a predisposition? Is a predisposition something you have to learn? No. By definition, predispositions are something you're born with. So we can definitely say that predispositions are not a nurture phenomenon, because they exist independently of your environment. But here's the catch. A predisposition is not driven purely by genetics. Predispositions happen because of the way your brain is structured. Now, it's true that genetics build your brain, but once the brain is built, genes are not directly in control of your brain activity. Genes aren't controlling the chemical reactions occurring between neurons. Genes aren't forcing you to see what you see, hear what you hear, and encounter the things you encounter. Genes don't force you to experience things. Brain structure and neuron activity are the main drivers of experience. Yes, genes can build predispositions into your brain structure and activity, but it wouldn't be honest to say that brain activity itself is directly driven by genetics. Predispositions are both a result of genes and brain structure. Well, the thing is, if nature is both the bricks and the house, then it creates a problem, which is that the bricks and the house might behave in slightly different ways. For instance, let's say you build a house with adamantium bricks. In this case, the bricks themselves are going to be extremely resistant to damage or alteration. But if the house is built in a lazy or unintelligent way, for example, if you use crappy cement or build the house on a foundation of sand, the house will be extremely easy to knock down. Well, genes are like the bricks, and the rest of the body, including your brain, is kind of like the house. Genes themselves might be extremely resistant to environmental influence, but the things genes build might be a little bit easier for the environment to influence. The brain can learn, genes cannot. The brain can sense things in the environment and change its behavior in response. Genes cannot. This doesn't mean that genes don't matter. As the FOB research points out, genes do in fact have a strong connection to personality traits. But I don't think nature is just genes. I think it's more accurate to say that nature is any structural influence on behavior, which includes both genes and the body as a whole. Now, it's possible that nature still has a greater effect on human behavior than nurture does, even with my definitions. But I don't think the FLB adequately demonstrates this, simply because their definitions of nature and nurture are too narrow. So in the end, who was right? Was it the red pillars or the blue pillars? I think the answer is both. And neither. I think one of the biggest problems with the red pill, aside from the grifting, is that red pillars tend to fall into the trap of thinking that human sexuality only has to do with nature, which can't be true, as I've explained. Of course, the reason red pillars think this way is because we live in a society which often denies the role of nature in human sexuality. Because when you go outside the red pill, one of the biggest traps people tend to fall into is thinking that human sexuality only has to do with nurture. Now, there are some blue pillars who do seem to believe that nature plays a role in sexuality, but only some of the time, and only when the conclusions aren't too uncomfortable. Many blue pillars will admit that facial attractiveness plays into a person's overall attractiveness, and of course genetics do determine facial attractiveness, but blue pillars never seem to take this questioning much further. For example, if nature is related to facial attractiveness, could nature also be involved in other elements of attraction and unconscious sexual behavior? Could nature be involved in what personality types you're unconsciously drawn toward? Could nature affect your overall approach towards sexual encounters, even the way you feel when you're attracted to someone? Could nature affect men and women differently, since men and women have different reproductive systems? Could nature affect women's sexual behaviors? And if so, how? These are questions blue pillars tend to avoid, usually because they're uncomfortable with these lines of reasoning and the conclusions they might lead to. But of course, a scientifically minded person must be willing to ask questions like these. However, it also seems like the people who ask these kinds of questions are often extremely biased, which creates its own problem. Ultimately, human sexuality is neither completely nature-driven or completely nurture-driven. Both of these perspectives are extremes that cannot be true by logical necessity. So in order to fully and accurately understand sexuality, you must account for both the nature side and the nurture side. And in my opinion, neither the red pill nor the blue pill really do this very well at the moment. And that is the end of the episode. Believe it or not, I still have more thoughts on nature and nurture, but this episode is already way too long, and I've covered most of what I think, so I'll have to talk about the rest at a later date. That is, if I remember to. Anyway,